What's up, people? This is Nate Morris, MasterLSAT.com, and in this video, we're going to master questions 21 through 26 of the logical reasoning section from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. So if you haven't already, follow the link in the description to try this test first on your own, and then we will master all the questions that you had trouble with together. For each question, we start by going over the paragraph and figuring out what to look for in the answer choices. Then we individually analyze each answer choice. You can use the timestamps below to jump in between questions. 21, we're looking for a principle to justify the developer's reasoning. So let's read the argument. It says the builders of this apartment complex won't complete it unless there's a road built that connects it to the town of Sierra. And then it says if this apartment complex is completed, it would strengthen Sierra's economy. And if that happens, that would benefit every Sierra resident. Therefore, conclusion, the residents of Sierra should vote in favor of a tax to fund the construction of this road. Why? What's the support for that conclusion? Why should they vote that way? Well, if we tie everything together that we just read, it's because building the road will allow the complex to be built, which would strengthen their economy, which would benefit them, right? They're voting for a tax that would allow all of this chain of events to happen that would end up benefiting them, and therefore they should vote for it, right? So if we wanted to look for a principle to tie the support to the conclusion, then we want to look for a principle that gets from the fact that it would benefit all of them to therefore proving that therefore they should vote for a tax that would allow it to happen, right? If support, then conclusion. If there is a certain thing that would benefit the residents of Sierra or of a town, then they should vote for a tax that allows that thing to happen, right? That's if support, then conclusion. That's what would prove this conclusion. So we want to look for something like that in the answer choices. A says if a particular construction project is necessary in order to strengthen a town's economy, then the residents of that town should vote for that project to happen. That doesn't apply here, though, because the paragraph never tells us that this construction project is necessary in order to strengthen Sierra's economy. It just says that if it happened, it would strengthen Sierra's economy. But that's not the same thing as saying that it's necessary. It's the only possible way to strengthen the town's economy. It never says that. It just says it would strengthen the town's economy. Maybe there are 99 other possible things that they could do that would strengthen their economy. So it might not be necessary to do this to strengthen the economy, and therefore A doesn't prove anything. A just says if a particular project were necessary to strengthen the economy, then they should vote in favor of it. But because this paragraph never tells us that this project is necessary to strengthen the economy, then we don't know whether A proves anything or not, and therefore it's not the answer. B, if you picked this answer, then you made a classic textbook mistake in conditional logic, because, as you may know, saying that if X, then Y is not the same thing as saying if not X, then not Y, right? If I say if it's raining, then it's cloudy, that's true. That's not the same thing as saying if it's not raining, then it's not cloudy. That's not necessarily true, right? Those two statements don't mean the same thing, right? So remember, we are looking for an answer on this question that takes the support and says anytime that support is true, if that support is true, then this conclusion is true. If voting for something will benefit you, then you should vote for it. B says they shouldn't vote for a tax to fund a project unless that project will produce results. So B introduces that as a necessary condition, not as a sufficient condition, right? We want B to say that they should vote in favor of a local tax to fund a construction project if it will produce results that benefit them, right? That would make sense. If it will produce results that benefit them, then they should vote for it. But B says only if it will produce results that benefit them should they vote for it, right? It says they shouldn't vote unless. That's not the same thing, right? If I want to say if X, then Y, that's not the same thing as saying not Y unless X. Do you see what I'm saying? If I want to say if it's raining, then it's cloudy, that's true. That's not the same thing as saying it's not cloudy unless it's raining, because that doesn't make sense. It's backwards. It's the same thing as saying it's not raining unless it's cloudy, right? Hopefully this is making sense. If not, I highly recommend that you check out the Master LSAT videos on sufficient versus necessary and conditional logic. but B is mixing things up. It's introducing the support as a necessary condition for the conclusion, not as a sufficient one. You don't want it to say that they shouldn't vote unless this is true. You want it to say that they should vote if this is true. And those two things are not the same. C is a little peripheral because C says whenever a town funds a construction project, they should use a tax rather than by funding it through debt. But that has nothing to do with proving this conclusion. This conclusion is, should they vote for the tax, right? The conclusion is saying they should vote for this tax. C doesn't help prove how they should vote. C just is saying what the town should do, how a town should act, that a town should fund it by a tax rather than by a debt. But it doesn't speak to whether the residents of Sierra should vote in favor of this tax, right? And that is literally what the conclusion is saying, which is not the same thing as what C is talking about. D does not help us prove our conclusion because D says only the residents who will benefit from a project should be required to have to pay the tax to fund that project. But that's not what this conclusion is about. The conclusion is not about who should have to pay the tax and who shouldn't have to pay the tax. It's about whether we should vote in favor of the tax existing or not, right? So the conclusion, we're just simply trying to prove here that the residents of Sierra should vote in favor of this tax. D, the principle in D is about who should be required to pay that tax, right? That's not the same thing. We're trying to prove that people should vote a certain way, whereas D is proving that certain people should or shouldn't be required to pay a tax. So that's not exactly the same thing. We have to be very precise when we want to prove the conclusion. We have to check exactly what the conclusion is saying. E is perfect because E says anyone who would benefit from a construction project, right? In other words, the residents of Sierra here, they would benefit from the results of that project because it would strengthen their economy and that would benefit them according to the paragraph. So E says anyone who would benefit from a project should vote in favor of a tax to fund that project, which is literally what this conclusion is saying. So E takes the information presented in this paragraph and proves the conclusion, right? E says anytime you have people in this situation that they would benefit from a project, these Sierra residents, in other words, E says they should vote in favor of a local tax to fund that project. So it literally proves exactly this conclusion, and it's exactly what we were looking for. Let's look at 22. This was a tricky question for a lot of people. A lot of people stumbled on this one, but I think we'll see it's actually simpler than you may have thought. We're looking for something to weaken this argument. The argument's a little strange, so let's just try to understand what is being said. Because medieval epistemology is a complex subject, historians have, until recently, been unable to produce a definition that would help determine what should be included and what shouldn't be included in it, right? We haven't been able to define it well. Clearly, says this person, here's the solution. The solution is just to define medieval epistemology as the epistemological beliefs of the medieval epistemologists, right? That would be an easy solution, says this person, right? Because that way, if we want to know whether medieval epistemology includes some epistemological claim, all we have to do is ask whether any medieval epistemologists believe that claim. If any of them did, then it's part of medieval epistemology. And by the way, if any of them believe the opposite, then that opposite claim would also be part of medieval epistemology. So it's okay, even if they disagreed with each other, it doesn't matter. Anything that was believed by medieval epistemologists, that would be part of medieval epistemology, right? So this person's arguing that that would be the best solution. So we have to weaken that argument and show that no, that's not a good solution to this problem. So let's go ahead and look for something that does that in the answer choices. A is irrelevant because this argument is about medieval epistemologists. So A tells us that, by the way, medieval epistemologists happen to have held some of the same beliefs as ancient epistemologists. Who cares about ancient epistemologists? We are only arguing about how to define medieval epistemology, right? So how on earth would this weaken the argument? If anything, I could make a better argument for it strengthening the argument, right? Because A tells you that these medieval epistemologists held some of the same beliefs as the ancient ones. So if we want to figure out what these medieval epistemologists believed, which is what this historian is arguing would be an easy solution, according to A, we have another way that we can do it, which is we can, if we can't figure it out directly, we can figure it out indirectly from the ancient epistemologists. So if anything, it kind of gives us another path to figuring out what their beliefs were, right? Which this person's arguing is a good and easy solution, and therefore, if anything, it's closer to strengthening the argument than it is to weakening it. Ultimately, I don't think it does either, but my point is that it definitely doesn't weaken the argument. B is neither here nor there, right? Because this person's arguing that we should define medieval epistemology by just looking at what the epistemological beliefs were of medieval epistemologists. B says, by the way, those epistemological beliefs of those people happen to also depend upon their non-epistemological beliefs. Okay, who cares? What does that have to do with how we should define medieval epistemology, right? This person's arguing that an easy solution would be to look at what they believed epistemologically. B is saying, by the way, those depended on their non-epistemological beliefs. What does that matter? That doesn't change anything. C is neither here nor there, because who cares whether most medieval epistemologists also wrote things that had nothing to do with epistemology? Who cares? Because this argument is not concerned with those other things that they wrote, those other passages that they wrote, right? We're just concerned with their epistemological beliefs. And this person argues that whatever their epistemological beliefs are, that should be the definition of medieval epistemology. C is saying, well, they also wrote other passages about other things. Okay, great. Who cares? That's irrelevant. I'm sure they did lots of things. I'm sure they also played ball with their children, right? What does that have to do with anything, right? The question is their epistemological beliefs, this person is arguing, should be part of the definition of medieval epistemology. So telling me that they also did other things is neither here nor there. So D is a trick answer that a lot of people pick, but it doesn't do anything because D simply tells us that these medieval epistemologists, some of them had beliefs that contradicted the epistemological beliefs of other of their peers, right? So according to D, that would mean that some of the beliefs that are part of epistemology contradict with each other. But that doesn't weaken the argument because the argument itself even says that that's okay. It says in the last couple sentences, right? It says in the last sentence that if any believed something, it's part of medieval epistemology. And if any of them believe the opposite, then that opposite claim is also part of medieval epistemology. So clearly it doesn't matter. So D doesn't weaken the argument at all because the argument says it's okay if they contradict with each other. They're both part of medieval epistemology. So therefore this does nothing. So E is a little sneaky, but it is the correct answer, right? Because this person's argument is that they have a viable solution to this problem of how to define medieval epistemology. This person says, here's a viable solution. All we have to do is look at what the epistemological beliefs were of medieval epistemologists. E says, no, that's not a viable solution. That's not so easy because we don't even know who the medieval epistemologists were. It says there's much debate as to which of the medieval thinkers were epistemologists, if any. We don't even know if any of them were epistemologists. And therefore, this solution doesn't sound so good. It doesn't sound so viable anymore. It directly attacks the viability of this solution, right? So therefore, it weakens the argument, right? The whole purpose of this argument was to say, clearly, this is a good solution. That's what this person says. They have a solution. All we have to do is this. But E says, no, we can't do that, right? This person says all you have to do is make a list of all the epistemological beliefs of the medieval epistemologists. But E says, no, how on earth are you going to do that? Because we don't even know who the medieval epistemologists were, if there were any of them. And therefore, it directly weakens the argument. Question 23, why is the argument flawed? So the argument says that a few months ago, the fines for parking violations on the streets were raised to help pay for a new parking garage. Since then, parking violations on our streets have dropped by half. Therefore, if we want there to be even fewer parking violations, the fines should be raised again. Why is that a flawed argument? What are we assuming here? Clearly, we're assuming that the raising of the fines is what caused there to be fewer parking violations, right? Just because something happened right before something else doesn't mean it caused that thing. Anything else could have caused that, right? And specifically, they even kind of spilled it out in the paragraph. They told you what were the fines raised to fund to help pay for this new parking garage. So it's kind of giving you another potential reason in the paragraph. Might that new parking garage be a potential reason why there were fewer parking violations on the street? Maybe because now there's this parking garage right there and maybe now people can park there instead of parking on the street. So that's another potential reason why parking violations cut in half. Maybe it's not the fines, maybe it's the garage that just opened, right? And so that's how we have to attack this argument, right? The argument is assuming that the raising of the fines is what caused there to be fewer violations, and that's why it makes this conclusion that therefore we should raise the fines again, and that will cause there to be even fewer parking violations. But what if that's not the reason? What if there's a different reason for why there are fewer parking violations, namely for example, what if it's because of this new parking garage that opened? That's why people aren't parking on the street as much anymore and having parking violations on the street. So that's what we want to look for in the answer choices. A is a bit tricky, but it doesn't make sense because A says that this argument takes something that might be an effect of a reduction and treats it as if it's a possible cause of that reduction. Well, first of all, what's the reduction we're talking about in this paragraph? There's only one reduction. That is the 50% reduction in parking violations, which is what we are trying to explain. Why did that happen? But A doesn't make sense because A says it takes a possible effect of that 50% parking violation reduction and treats it as if it's a possible cause of that reduction. What possible effect is there of that reduction? This paragraph doesn't identify anything that might have been an effect, right? What was caused by that reduction? We don't know from this paragraph, right? And it does treat something as a possible cause of that reduction, right? It treats the fines being raised, right? It assumes that that's a cause of the reduction. But that thing, the fines being raised, that's not a possible effect of the reduction. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because the fines being raised happened before the parking violation reduction. So how could it have been an effect of that? That wouldn't make any sense, right? It says in the paragraph 6 months ago, the fines were raised. And since then, parking violations have dropped, right? So it's absolutely impossible that the reduction caused the fines to increase because the fines increased first. And then since then, the parking violations dropped. So how could you say how could you say that it takes a possible effect of a reduction and it treats it as a cause? The thing that it treats as a possible cause, which is the fines being raised, that's not a possible effect. That cannot possibly be an effect of the reduction because to be an effect of the reduction, it would have to obviously happen after the reduction. So as you can see, A doesn't really make sense. Of course, it's not really what we were looking for anyway. It's kind of meant to confuse you, but the best thing to do on these questions is to have a clear prediction for what you're looking for and then kind of just get away from everything else. Look for an easy answer. A is definitely not an easy answer, and it's wrong. B is almost right. Does the argument take for granted that raising fines a second time will reduce parking violations? Yes, it does. But read the whole answer choice. Does it take for granted that raising fines a second time will reduce parking violations at least as much as the first time? No, it never says that. The argument never says how much it thinks parking violations will be reduced the second time. It just says if we want there to be even fewer parking violations, in other words, if we want to reduce parking violations again, we should raise the fines. But it doesn't say by how much. It doesn't assume that it's going to be at least as much or more or less or equal to the first time. It never mentions anything about quantity. Right? We know that the first time it dropped by 50%, it could be that this person thinks that if we raise fines again, maybe it'll fall another 1 or 2%, right? We don't know. The person just says that if we want there to be even fewer, meaning if we want it to reduce again, then we should raise the fines, but we don't know how much this person thinks it's going to be reduced, so B doesn't really make any sense. C is irrelevant because what does it matter what the financial benefits that the city is getting from these fines are? It doesn't make a difference. The argument is simply arguing a causal argument, right? If we want there to be even fewer parking violations, then we should raise the fines again, right? So what do financial benefits that we're getting from the fines, what does that have to do with whether that causality is true or not, right? This person's arguing that if we raise the fines again, there will be even fewer parking violations. So that would be true whether or not we are getting financial benefits from the fines. It doesn't change anything. D is irrelevant because why would we care about people's desires, right? D says that the argument takes for granted that people who park their cars illegally would actually prefer to park legally. Well, why does it matter? Why does it take that for granted? That's not what this argument takes for granted because this argument has nothing to do with people's desires. It's simply a causal argument. It's saying that hypothetically, if we raise the fines again, then that would cause there to be fewer parking violations, right? Probably because it thinks that people are going to be deterred by the fines, so they are going to be more diligent not to park illegally. So we don't have to assume that they prefer to park legally in order for that to make sense, right? We're saying that they probably prefer to park illegally, they're just not doing it because of the fines, right? So D doesn't really make any sense. What do their desires have to do with anything? We're simply deterring them, according to this person, we're deterring them from parking illegally because of the fines. So we're not assuming that they would rather prefer to park legally. No, we're assuming they want to park illegally and they're simply not doing it because of the fines. At least that's what this person's arguing. So D doesn't really make sense because their desires are irrelevant. E is exactly what we said we were looking for, because this argument just assumes that the raising of the fines was what caused the parking violation reduction. But it doesn't establish that the initial decrease in parking violations wasn't due to the availability of additional parking spaces, right? We said that we built a new parking garage. So how do we know that wasn't the reason for the initial decrease in parking violations, right? It seems like it very well might have been, and that's exactly what E is pointing out. It's worded in a slightly confusing way because it's a double negative, right? It says fails to establish that that decrease was not due to the availability of additional parking spaces. So it fails to establish that it wasn't due. It's kind of a double negative, but that's exactly why this argument is flawed, because in order for the argument to make sense, in order to argue that the raising of the fines caused the reduction, you would have to establish, this person would have to establish that it wasn't due to this other thing in order to establish that it was due to the raising of the fines, right? They would have to establish that it wasn't due to the availability of additional parking spaces. And it didn't do that. It failed to establish that. It failed to establish what it would have had to establish to make this a sensible argument. And that's why E makes sense. E is pointing out that exact flaw that we pointed out when we read the paragraph, albeit in a slightly confusing wording, but if you read through it carefully, it makes perfect sense. 24, let's go ahead and look for something that would weaken this argument. So first we have to understand what the argument is saying. Some agricultural crops are now being genetically engineered to make important drugs. However, says this person, that raises the possibility that the drugs are going to end up in the general food supply. Why? Since if pollen from a drug-producing crop drifts into a nearby field in which an ordinary non-drug-producing crop of that same species is being grown, the pollen could fertilize that crop and turn it into a drug-producing crop, right? So we have to figure out a way to weaken this argument, right? The conclusion is that it raises the possibility that the drugs will end up in the general food supply. Why? Because of this whole possible chain of events that is spelled out in the second half of the paragraph. So we have to weaken the argument, and we have to say, nah, you don't have anything to worry about. Don't worry about it. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for an answer that says, no, even though, yes, this is possible in theory, but don't worry, it's not actually going to happen, right? We want to disprove the conclusion. We want to show, no, there's no possibility that it will end up in the general food supply. And there are a few ways we can do that, right? Because there are a few assumptions in this reasoning, right? It says, if pollen from a drug-producing crop drifts into a nearby field in which an ordinary non-drug-producing crop of the same species is being grown, right? So first of all, we could potentially weaken the argument by saying that's never the case. There never is a nearby field with the same species being grown, right? Maybe that's a potential way we could weaken the argument, right? And then it says the pollen could fertilize that crop and turn it into a drug-producing crop as well. So I don't know, maybe we could find a way to weaken that by showing that, yeah, even though that could happen, it still wouldn't end up in the general food supply, right? So there are a few places that we can attack this argument from. So anyway, as long as we understand the logic and what we're looking for an answer that says, nah, there's nothing to worry about. Don't worry, it's not going to end up in the general food supply. Your conclusion is not necessarily true. So let's go ahead and look for that. A says that as far as we know, none of these drugs, if they were present in the general food supply, would present any danger to public health. Okay, that's good to know, but it doesn't weaken the conclusion, because the conclusion is just saying they might end up in the general food supply. So A doesn't weaken that conclusion. A just says, even if that conclusion is true, there's nothing to worry about in terms of danger to public health. But that has nothing to do with whether the conclusion is true or not, right? We have to weaken the conclusion, right? The conclusion is that there's a possibility that they'll end up in the general food supply. A doesn't make that any less likely. A just says, even if you, consumer advocate, are correct with your argument, then you don't have to worry about danger to public health. But that doesn't weaken the argument, because if you're correct, then you're correct, and it's a good argument, right? So this doesn't attack the conclusion. This attacks a possible thing that you might have thought was an offshoot of the conclusion. But that's not what this argument is saying, and therefore A is irrelevant, right? You have to stay precise. What is the conclusion saying? The conclusion is saying that there's a possibility that they will end up in the general food supply. A does not weaken that one bit. A just says that if that does happen, we don't have to worry about dangers to public health. So B doesn't weaken our argument, because B says if the pollen is prevented from drifting into these nearby fields, then there would be no risk of fertilization. But who's to say that that prevention is happening, right? It never tells us that that prevention is happening. The paragraph doesn't say that we're doing anything to prevent it. In fact, that's what the paragraph is saying we should be worried about, is the fact that this could happen. B says, don't worry, if you prevent it from happening, then there's nothing to worry about. But we're not preventing it from happening. So why should that weaken this argument? C is a bit of a trick answer because C tells us that these crops that produce these drugs are not among the species that comprise the largest portions of the general food supply. Okay, but who cares whether they're the largest portions or average size portions or smallest portions of the general food supply? It doesn't matter. If they're in the food supply, then this conclusion is potentially true, right? The conclusion isn't that there's a possibility that the drugs will end up in a large portion of the general food supply, right? Then maybe this would weaken that argument. It doesn't say that. The conclusion of the argument is simply that it raises the possibility that the drugs will end up in the general food supply. So telling me that the crops don't comprise the largest portions of the general food supply, okay, maybe they comprise the smallest portions of the general food supply. It'll still end up in the food supply either way, so this doesn't weaken the conclusion at all. So let's read D. D says in these crops that produce these drugs, the drugs are not present in any part of the plant used for food in ordinary crops of the same species. This destroys the conclusion, because the conclusion said that this might fertilize that crop in a neighboring field and turn that into a drug-producing crop as well. And this person was saying, well, therefore it might end up in the general food supply. But D says, no, there's nothing to worry about. Why? Because even if that did happen, even if it did fertilize that crop to turn it into a drug-producing crop, it's okay because the drugs are not present in any part of the plant that is going to enter the food supply, right? And so therefore it's okay, right, if that other plant that is being used for the food supply is turned into a drug-producing crop. It doesn't matter because the drug itself is not present in the part that is going to enter the food supply, and therefore that destroys the conclusion. It says, no, there is no possibility that the drugs will end up in the general food supply according to D. So this very much weakens the argument and therefore is the correct answer, right? It's what we were looking for. We were looking for an answer that says, no, there's nothing to worry about. Don't worry. It's not the part of the plant that's used for food, so it's not going to enter the food supply after all. E says that if this happened, if pollen from a drug-producing crop turned an ordinary crop of the same species into a drug-producing crop, if this thing happened that the consumer advocate is worried about, then it would be possible for scientists to identify the latter crop. Okay, but that has nothing to do with whether it will happen or not, right? The argument is saying that this might happen, and therefore they might end up in the general food supply. E is saying, well, it would be possible to determine, it would be possible for scientists to identify that latter crop. Okay, but that doesn't tell me that they will identify the latter crop. And even if they do, it doesn't tell me that they will somehow prevent it from reaching the food supply. So it has nothing to do with whether it will enter the food supply or not. It just says, by the way, it'll be possible for scientists to identify the latter crop. Nothing to do, though, with whether it will actually end up entering the food supply or not, right? Another thing is that who says when they're going to identify it? Maybe they'll only identify it 6 months later after people have been eating it, right, in their cereal. I don't know. I'm just pointing out reasons why E does not weaken the conclusion, right? It has nothing to do with whether it will reach the general food supply. It just says scientists would be able to potentially identify the latter crop. So it's not what we're looking for. Number 25, I figured this would be an easier one to draw out on the whiteboard. So the conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed. So we have to fill in the blank here. We have to figure out what the missing gap in the logic is. So the argument says that most of the members of Unit 17 are computer programmers. Therefore, conclusion, it must be that some of the employees who work in the Hansen building are computer programmers since blank. We have to fill in the blank with what's missing. Well, this seems just like many other LSAT questions that you may have seen, where the conclusion is trying to connect A to C, and the evidence to do that has to connect A to B and B to C, right? In order to prove that we can connect A to C. Except they only gave us one of those links, and we have to figure out what the missing link is. So let's draw this out in sort of a linear fashion, right? The conclusion is, thus it is certain that some of the people who work in the Hansen building. So the conclusion is that some of the people who work in the Hansen building, we'll just say some HB, we are trying to prove that some HB are computer programmers, are CP, right? And why does this person say that's true? What's the evidence explicitly given in the paragraph for that? Well, the evidence given in the paragraph connects Unit 17 with computer programmers. It says most of Unit 17 are computer programmers. So as you can see, if we think about this as A and this as B and this as C, we're trying to get from A to C. That's our conclusion, right? And they get us from B to C. They do that for us, right? So as you can see, our missing gap here is getting from A to B, right? That's what we have to do to prove this conclusion, is to get from some HB to most of 17, right? It's a very simple structure. We've seen this on many other questions. If the conclusion is connecting A to C and the evidence given says, how do I know that A connects with C? Because B connects with C. Well, they're assuming that A connects with B, and that's the missing piece of the puzzle, right? This is the missing piece of the puzzle that, if we assume, is going to prove this conclusion. If we can get from A to B, we can already get from B to C from the paragraph, and therefore we would know that we can get from A to C. So this is going to be the missing assumption, is connecting some HB with most of 17. Now the question is, what is that sentence going to look like? It sounds a little confusing, right? Some people who work in the Hansen building are most of the Unit 17. That's a little bit of an awkward sentence, but that is what we have to look for, something that tells us that, something that tells us that at least some people who work in the Hansen building are part of this majority of 17 that are computer programmers, right? Because in order to use the information given, right, that most of 17 is computer programmers, this person says, well, that proves that some HB are computer programmers. In order to prove that, we would have to know that some of the HB are part of that majority of 17 in order to know that they are computer programmers. In order to know that some of the HB are computer programmers, which is what we are trying to prove. That's the conclusion, right? The conclusion is always the long bridge, and then the pieces of evidence are the links in the chain, the tiles of the bridge that get you there, and you have to find the missing tile. So let's look for an answer that gets us from A to B, that gets us from some HB to most of 17. A is not going to help us at all because A says most of the employees who belong to Unit 17. So it does start here, but then it says most of the ones who belong to 17 but are not computer programmers work in the Hansen building. That doesn't help us out because we're trying to prove that some of the people in the Hansen building are computer programmers, right? A helps us prove that most of the employees who belong to 17 but are not computer programmers work in the Hansen building. So that proves that some of the people who work in the Hansen building are not computer programmers, which is not what we're trying to prove, right? We're trying to prove that some of the people who work in the Hansen building are computer programmers. So that's just the opposite. B is tricky, but B says most members of the executive committee of Unit 17 work in the Hansen building, right? I don't know who comprises that executive committee. That's something that was heretofore not mentioned, right? And so we know that most of 17 are computer programmers, but I don't know if most of 17 has anything to do with the executive committee of 17. It could be that, let's say this is Unit 17, let's say this is the most of 17 that are computer programmers. Maybe the executive committee is just this bunch of people over here. So telling me that there's overlap between the executive committee and the Hansen building, I don't know if any of these people are computer programmers. They might be part of the minority that are not computer programmers, right? So that's a problem. The executive committee is kind of an X factor here that we don't really know how to define. So C is very tricky, but it actually doesn't prove the conclusion. There's another answer that when you compare C with that other answer, you'll see that the other one is better. But let's talk about why C doesn't prove the conclusion, because C seems to connect HB with 17, but it doesn't connect some HB with most of 17. It says most HB are some of 17, so it's kind of backwards, right? We want to say that most of 17 is some HB. C says most of the employees who work in HB belong to, so are some of Unit 17, right? So that's not what we're looking for, right? Because let's think about why that doesn't prove the conclusion, because we know that most of Unit 17 is computer programmers. So let's say this diagram is 17, and this is the majority of 17 that are computer programmers, right? Telling me that C is true, that most of HB are members of 17, that doesn't mean that they're part of that majority of 17. It could be that this other circle over here is Hansen building, and as you can see, most of Hansen building is part of 17, but they don't necessarily have to make up that majority of 17 that are computer programmers, so they might not be computer programmers. Do you see what I'm saying? This doesn't prove that some Hansen building people are computer programmers. Just because most of Hansen building, if this circle is Hansen building workers, yes, most of them are part of this circle of 17 unit workers, right? But they might not be part of the majority of 17 that are computer programmers, and that's why C does not prove the conclusion. So D is perfect. It's exactly connecting these two things. We wanted to connect some HB with most of 17, and that's literally what this says. Most of the members of Unit 17 work in the Hansen building. In other words, they are some Hansen building workers, right? Most of Unit 17 is some of the Hansen building workers, right? This proves our conclusion. And if you want to think about it visually, we know that, let's say this circle diagram is all of the workers in Unit 17. We know that most of them are computer programmers, right? So let's say that this is the most of them that are computer programmers. If you tell me that most of them work in the Hansen building, then no matter how you slice it, it'll have to overlap with this majority, right? Let's say that this is the most of them that work in the Hansen building. As you can see, the two majorities have to overlap, right? There's no way around that, right? If you were to tell me that a minority, that some of Unit 17 were Hansen building workers, well, then that could be part of this minority of 17 over here. Maybe it doesn't overlap. But if you tell me that most of 17 works in the Hansen building, then that majority, no matter how you slice it, let's say it's sliced this way, right? If you're imagining that this is a set of data points, let's say this is the majority that works in the Hansen building. As you can see, it overlaps with the other majority that are computer programmers, right? If you tell me that most of a set of data points are X, and you also tell me that most of that set of data points are Y, then there has to be some overlap between X and Y. For example, if you tell me that the majority of the population of America likes basketball, and you also tell me that the majority of the population of America likes fishing, that proves that there must be at least one person who likes basketball and also likes fishing, right? Because it's impossible for a majority, which is more than half, to not intersect with another majority, which is also more than half. It's possible to have a majority and a minority that don't intersect. So if you tell me that most of America likes basketball, that could be this majority. And if you tell me that some people in America like fishing, that could be some of these people over here, right? So maybe they don't overlap. But if you also tell me that most of America likes fishing, it'll have to bite into this majority of basketball lovers as well. So hopefully this all makes sense, but I think the simplest way to see it is that D just matches exactly these words. Most of 17 are some of the people who work in the Hansen building. In other words, most of 17 work in the Hansen building. That's literally what this says, which is what we predicted as what we needed to know to prove this conclusion. E, I think, is the easiest to cross off because it has nothing to do with Unit 17, right? It just connects the Hansen building. It says most of HB are government employees. So it kind of goes in a different direction, right? Government employees. And it doesn't say some, it says most of them are government employees. So this is not filling in this gap. We knew that we had to connect HB with Unit 17, and E doesn't do that, so we still have a missing link in the argument, even if E is true. 26 is a dreaded parallel flawed reasoning question, but don't assume that it's going to be hard because a lot of these are very simple, and I think this one was fairly simple. So let's try to get the logical skeleton of the argument so that we can find an argument that matches that same skeleton. So every lab in my neighborhood is well behaved, right? That sounds like a simple statement. Every X is Y, right? Perfect. All X's are Y. Done. Next sentence. However, no pet would be well behaved, right? It wouldn't be Y if it were not trained. So let's call trained Z, right? We're establishing variables for everything so that we can turn it into a general skeleton so that we can look for an answer that matches that same skeleton. So far we have three variables, X, Y, and Z. Every X is Y. However, it couldn't be Y unless Z, unless it were trained. Therefore, conclusion, it is training, not the genetic makeup of the breed, that accounts for their good behavior, right? It's training, it's Z. It's not the genetic makeup of their breed, that's X, the fact that they are of the breed of Labrador Retriever. We're saying it must not be X that causes Y, it must rather be Z, the training, right? So once again, every X is Y, but Y would be impossible without Z. Therefore, it must be Z that causes Y, not X that causes Y. So of course, that's a flawed argument because how do you know that? Maybe X causes Y, maybe it's not Z, right? So you don't really know what it is that accounts for Y. You just know that every X is Y, and you also know that it can't be Y without Z, but you haven't established whether it's X or Z or both that account for Y or something else, right? We don't really know. But anyway, it's not our job to point out why this is flawed. It's simply our job to identify that skeleton, which I think we have, and let's go ahead and look through the answers to find one that matches that exact same structure. A is almost the right answer because A says all the students at Breiker excel, and then it says they wouldn't excel if they didn't have good teachers. So that sounds like our initial argument. Every X is Y, every student excels, but they wouldn't be Y if they weren't Z. They wouldn't be excelling if they didn't have good teachers. So what should this now say? If A were the right answer, what would the next sentence have to say? Well, you should recall our initial skeleton. Our initial skeleton was every X is Y, but not Y unless Z. Therefore, it must be Z that causes Y, not X, right? So we should want this to continue by saying, therefore, it must be good teachers that account for their excelling, not the fact that they are a student at Breiker School. Does it say that? No. It says, therefore, all schools should hire good teachers if they want their students to do well. That's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for a should statement, right? Our initial paragraph didn't say that, therefore, everyone should train their dogs, right? It doesn't say that. It just says it's the training, not the breed, that accounts, that causes this thing that we observed. So that's what we're looking for here. That's what A should say to be the right answer. It must be the teachers, not the fact that they are students at this school, that causes this excelling that we've observed, right? So A doesn't say that, and therefore it's wrong. Let's take a look at B. B says every time it snows, there are more car crashes. So far, so good, right? That's exactly how our initial argument started. Every lab is well behaved, right? B says every time it snows, there are more car crashes, right? Whenever it snows is the same thing as saying every time it snows, right? So every time that it snows, every X, there is Y. There's more car crashes. But it says in general, there wouldn't be Y unless people were careless, unless Z. This is perfect, right? Every X is Y, but there wouldn't be Y without Z, right? Every lab is well behaved, but they couldn't be well behaved if they weren't trained. Every time it snows, there are more car crashes, but there wouldn't be car crashes unless people were careless. So how should B continue if it were to be the right answer? We want it to say, therefore, it must be Z that accounts for Y, not X, right? It must be the training that accounts for their behavior, not the genetic makeup, right? So we should want this to say, therefore, it must be carelessness that causes the more car crashes, not the snow. Does it say that? Yes, it says. So it's not the snow, it's not the icy roads, it's not X, but it must be Z, carelessness, that accounts for Y, the car crashes when it snows. This is exactly perfect. It matches our initial skeleton perfectly and therefore is the correct answer. C starts off well. It says every musician I know is a good dancer, right? So every X is Y. That's perfect, right? And we should want this to continue by saying, however, you can't have Y unless Z, right? Every lab is well behaved, but it couldn't be well behaved if it weren't trained, right? So we should want this to say, every musician I know is a good dancer, but no one could be a good dancer unless they take dance lessons, right? It should say something like that, but it doesn't say that. It says, every mathematician I know is a bad dancer. That's not exactly right. That doesn't match our initial skeleton. We don't say that every one thing is a good dancer and every of something else is a bad dancer, right? We don't say every lab is a well-behaved dog and every golden retriever is a poorly behaved dog. We don't say anything like that in the paragraph, so this is already out of the running. It doesn't match. We don't even have to finish reading it. Let's take a look at D. D says all the good cooks in my country use butter rather than margarine, and therefore, conclusion, if you want to be a good cook, you should also use butter rather than margarine. It sounds like a pretty decent argument, but it simply doesn't match our initial skeleton, and there are a few ways to point out why, but I think the simplest reason is that the conclusion is conditional, right? It says, therefore, if something, then something else. If you want to be a good cook, then you should use butter. That's not the structure of our initial conclusion. Our initial conclusion wasn't an if statement. It was just saying it must be training, not the fact that they are Labrador retrievers that causes them to behave well. It must be Z rather than X that causes Y. That's not at all what D sounds like. D says, if you want to be a good cook, you should do what the good cooks in my country do, right? So that's kind of a shortcut. It's just look at the conclusion and notice that the conclusion isn't the same structure as our initial conclusion. That's a good shortcut to sometimes cross off some of the easily wrong answers on these questions, right? The conclusion that we had was it must be Z, not X, that causes Y. And this conclusion is just a conditional statement. If you want to do something, then you should do something else. That's not the same structure, so this doesn't make sense. Let's look at E. E is a little confusing. E says, all the students in my class received an A, even though none of them can solve word problems. This is so far a little bit suspect because we never had anything like that in our initial paragraph, right? We never said every lab is well behaved, even though none of them know how to catch a ball, right? That is kind of foreign to our initial argument, so it pretty much seems unlikely already. Let's keep reading, right? It says all the students received an A, even though none can solve word problems, and then it says no student who is unable to solve word problems has an adequate understanding of algebra. So now it's saying that since they can't solve word problems, they don't have an adequate understanding of algebra, and then it says, therefore, they must not have received A's because they did any good work. Good work is a new variable, right? We have adequate understanding, we have good work, we have receiving A, we have solving word problems. There's too many variables here, right? It's too convoluted. It doesn't match our initial skeleton. We want to look for something much simpler, that every X is Y, but Y could not be true unless Z, and therefore it must be Z rather than X that causes Y. Remember, I'm just reminding you that's our initial skeleton, and when you say it next to E, or after having read through E, you can see that it doesn't really match at all. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.